Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of Devex. Delighted to be with you for what is going to be a very, very dynamic conversation today with an excellent group of panelists on what really is kind of the underlying theme of Davos this year. We heard Klaus this morning on stage, Professor Schwab, discussing Globalization 4.0. What underlies all of that is the idea that there are massive transformations required in our economy. And the title of the session sounds awfully innocuous, Building Sustainable Markets, right? Something we all agree on. But there's something underneath that which is really kind of provocative. The idea that what we have today, our energy system, our agriculture system, really the way we live, the way our economies work, is not sustainable. And that we need to do something radically different to get there, and you do that soon. So we have a group of people on stage who are working on these issues at various levels in various ways, and we're going to get into a really dynamic discussion, I think, about what the opportunity is. I think many of you in the room are familiar with these issues at some level. There's been a report recently saying there's a minimum $12 trillion economic opportunity if we get this right. We see in the headlines every day what happens when we get it wrong. There are also studies, the Boston Consulting Group has come out with an in-depth study that directly connects work in environmental, social, and governance with a company's value and with its profits. This is no longer a feel-good idea. This is directly relevant to the biggest issues in the world today and to companies' future survival. So we're going to talk about this issue at all of those levels today. And I want to just give you a very brief introduction to who we have on stage. We have the Minister of Social Development of Chile, Alfredo Moreno Charme. Down toward the end is Niama Bassunie, who is the Chief Executive Officer of WaystoCap in Morocco. Jesper Brodin is the Chief Executive Officer of Ingka Group, which is, of course, IKEA, as more commonly known, and you will explain. Aron Cramer, at the end of the stage, is President and Chief Executive Officer of Business for Social Responsibility, or BSR, as many people know you. And Finucane, who is the Chair of the Board of Bank of America Merrill Lynch in Europe, Vice Chair of Bank of America USA, and it doesn't say this here, but I understand is also leading all ESG efforts at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, so very relevant to the discussion today. So I thought I might begin with Jesper in the middle of the stage here. You run a large corporate. You are thinking about every day what your customers' demands are, what society's demands are, what will work in business. When you think about a sustainable market and where business plays in that, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so to start with, I think we're a vision-based company, so we have a vision to create a better everyday life for the many people, which is what we're known for in Life at Home, where we try our utmost to provide home furnishing at an affordable price to a lot of people. But we've taken, since many years back, we've taken that vision and truly placed it in our, first of all, our own responsibility, the footprints we have in climate, in resource consumption, in people topics, gender equality, etc. So we are fueled by that vision, and I would say over the years we have stepped from wanting to contribute to actually take responsibility for full impact on that agenda. But we also are stepping up the game because we see an opportunity to connect with hundreds of millions, if not a billion people, where we hope and think that we can perhaps influence them to live a sustainable life at home. We know that life at home is a big part of the climate footprint. And in our recent studies, we, to our slight surprise actually, we saw that up to 90% of people, 14,000 people interviewed in 14 markets, are prepared to do changes when it comes to climate.
Can I just make a little note about this? Because I think this is a theme you might hear throughout the discussion, and we're going to go to all of you for questions as well. This is a comparative advantage you're creating, right? We're used to businesses saying, we're going to try to sell you our product. You're actually trying to sell a vision. And if you do that well, it will redound to your benefit as a business.
Yeah, it's a choice to be made in a way in the end of the day. And for us, it's not so difficult to understand the connection to business, but it might be important because in a way, first of all, we see our customers are more and more believers and feel this is important, but also to be a big company to serve a lot of people from a cost perspective, the future doesn't look bright unless you crack the formula of circularity, of energy, etc. So therefore, it's also a matter of survival for our company.
Yeah, if your company is part of society, your employees, your customers are part of society, the survival of all of it is connected, right? In fact, I think that's a great point to bring in the Minister of Social Development from Chile. And of course, Minister, you were previously foreign affairs minister of Chile
Yes.
in an earlier administration. And you've also led a business association. You've been very active in the private sector too. So you bring kind of government as well as a private philosophy to this. What does it mean to you to actually build a sustainable market sitting in government?
Well, I have been my whole life in the private sector. I was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for 4 years, and now 1 year the Social Development Minister. But from the government point of view, the problem is how do you put the market to work for you? In terms of how do you put the market to work for social problems, in my case, or environmental problems. And in the case of social problems, is that how do you get poor people into the market? And when I mean poor people, it's not poor people in terms of saying only low-income people, but who are the problems, or who are the persons, or what are the problems where you have very tough problems that you cannot solve by yourselves. So what we did was to go all over the government, all ministries, all NGOs, and say, what are the problems that people have that are very tough and that they cannot solve by themselves? Those are the problems that are out of the market. And when you look at that, let me tell you a few figures in Chile. Chile is the most developed country in Latin America, very far away from Switzerland or whatever, but it's a middle-income country which has an average income close to Portugal or Poland. So in terms of Latin America, it's advanced. When you look at that, we have, let's say, more than 1 million people with no drinkable water still, or no sanitization systems. We have 40,000 people, inmates in jail, that are not able to have a new job when they finish their sentence. We have 500,000 women suffering intrafamily violence and with no personal income so that they cannot go away. So you look at that and you have many. In our case, we found out we had 16 different problems which were very tough, impossible for people to solve by themselves. So, and then we've tried to say, how can we put that into the market? And then we brought the best and more well-known business leaders, the best NGOs. We said, you are in charge. You tell me how to solve this. And they're finding out wonderful ideas.
I told you this would be a provocative session because the usual approach would be to say, well, government's just going to provide the social services. If there's a marginalized group, we'll just do it.
Well, the problem with that is that in Latin America and in many other parts of the world, is that people tend to think like that. But the end result is that you are very inefficient, very slow, and the end result, you have those problems. Because when I look at that, it's when a lot of years we were using that system. That system doesn't work enough, or it's not good enough for solving the problems of the people, or at least not fast enough.
And I think this point of, you've got a pretty developed country, but you still have these marginalized groups of people who need help, can be applied maybe, to bring Ann into the discussion, to the business world writ large, where there are a lot of successful corporations, businesses doing great in many ways, but it's not as connected to some of the issues you're talking about. That's starting to change with this focus on ESG, on environmental, social, and governance factors. This is something you think a lot about and work a lot on at Bank of America. Can we actually get these, when we think of billions and trillions, the financial markets, the sorts of folks who are here at Davos, can we actually connect them to people who don't have running water or who are recently incarcerated? Or can we connect them to those kinds of the people really being left behind in today's economy?
Yes, we can connect them. I think the thing is that it's taken a while to get there. And ESG is really a way, at least from my perspective, a way of thinking, a way of looking at problems. But you then have to bring in our case, because we're a bank, how can we bring capital to the issue? And how can we use the innovation we've used for corporations and clients for many years, hundreds of years, and apply it to this? And we've had success, but it means blended finance, meaning different tranches of financing against a gnarly project that otherwise wouldn't get done. Mm-hmm. It reduces the risk. It gives different horizons for payback. It allows also outcomes to be determined. So earlier today we were talking about water equity. There is a water equity fund that Gary White and Matt Damon started, that we participated in. We gave them the first $5 million into it. It is a $50 million fund. It returns about 3.5% to the investors, and with that money, they can provide water to thousands of people. It's a micro loan, so something that we couldn't do directly, but they can do, and we can provide the financing and also find other partners. And we've been able to take something like that and parlay that to probably in the last year $50 billion worth of investments in whether it's healthcare, water, clean air, women's issues, in a way that we would not have been able to do 5 years ago. It's taken some innovation, it's taken some very good bankers, it's taken partnerships with other financial institutions, NGOs, development banks, philanthropies that we couldn't have even imagined just a few years ago.
Yeah, that's a great, the Matt Damon and Gary White example is a great one because, they started out basically working like civil engineers would, digging wells, we need to get water to people, let's go dig another well. Now they've turned into financial engineers.
Right, but that began with, we were one of their earliest contributors. Gary had a checking account with us, and we gave him a philanthropic gift. He sort of took us through what he was trying to do, and it's an evolution. But the evolution can start a revolution, and we've been able to do it well beyond water. We've been able to do it with solar, with wind power, a project we're doing in solar in India that I couldn't have imagined us. And these are on big scales now.
You mentioned this at the beginning of your remarks, and I want to bring Aron in on this point, that it's happening, we're moving, it's a mindset shift, but that it's not happening as quickly as we might want, right? The urgency doesn't seem to be there. We could have had this conversation several years ago. Wouldn't have been as advanced as we might have now. There wouldn't have been as many reports or data points to prove, or as many case studies and examples. But look at the headlines. I mean, there's urgency around equity, right? I mean, there are literally people in the streets in a lot of countries in the world. How do we get there faster?
Well, I think the dominant reality right now is that we're living through a time with very profound interconnected revolutions, economic revolutions, technological revolutions, cultural, political. And so I would say that as important as building sustainable markets is, and it certainly is, we need to build resilient markets that can help us navigate all of this change. And I'll come to economic fairness in just a second. So, in doing that, companies are living in a very, very competitive and in many ways punishing present, which may be why we don't get as far to the future or get to the future.
They're too worried about this quarter.
Yeah. You've got to live in the present, which is very challenging, and a future that we know is going to be very different. Doing those two things at the same time is challenging. Governance matters a lot. Corporate governance matters, and public governance matters. One example that I think is very helpful is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, which asks that companies try to develop scenarios about how climate will affect their business. And that's a model that can be applied elsewhere. Facebook had been reporting on similar risks as it relates to privacy. The last year or so for them might have played out a little bit differently. And so that's a tool that I think can offer some really large benefits. But the new overlay is indeed basic economic fairness. And for all of the jargon that some of us who work in sustainability use so often, at the end of the day, citizens, employees, are wondering what their economic security is going to look like in a world that is changing very, very rapidly. And a lot of this just comes down to basic economic fairness. Will I have a steady job? Will I be able to provide for my family? Will I have retirement? And by the way, I may well live to be over 100 years old. How do I think about a career in that environment? So that is an overlay, and I think that's why we're seeing more and more companies think a little bit more. Microsoft just contributing $500 million to housing in Seattle is a very nice step, just one example.
And as someone who works in the global development arena, I see one danger being that we focus so much on the advanced economies and a lot of the political challenges there, we forget where people are really, really being left behind in a big way. And that brings us really to your business, Niama, in North Africa, but really working around the continent, a B2B platform that tries to bring essentially what we're very used to in other parts of the world in terms of a business network to companies in the continent. What do you see on the ground there? What is the sustainable market of the future in North Africa and beyond?
So as an African platform, what we've been very much focused on is how do we use technology and innovative business models to primarily remove barriers to entry for smaller and medium-sized enterprises, to eliminate information asymmetries, and hence actually create a more open and fair market where smaller and medium-sized enterprises can have a real chance in the international arena and can in a way engage with international trade and be able to compete fairly against larger corporations. So the way we've been doing it is we've been really focusing on two dynamics. So one, we've been focusing on building trade-related infrastructure, and this is where we use technology, digital solutions, tools to foster trust and create more openness in the market. And two, we've been very much focused on inclusiveness. But this inclusiveness comes from actually giving tools to smaller and medium-sized enterprises, because by giving tools, you're actually focusing on the long term rather than short-term incentives that distort the market. And sure, they can have an immediate effect, but does it really give us a long-term growth? And that's what, as a platform, we're very much focused on.
And by tools, you mean things like logistics, financing, credit.
Yeah, so tools can, in our case, come in many different ways. So it can come from providing better local payment solutions. It can come from facilitating logistics, streamlining import and export processes. And I think that's the key. When we talk about building infrastructure, it has to be customized, it has to be regionalized, and it has to be personalized to different countries and to what they truly need. And this is where you have to identify what the gaps are. What are the real infrastructure gaps in those countries, in those regions? And then thinking about technology and business models and innovative ways of creating that inclusiveness and giving that real access to smaller and medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah, if you think about a sustainable market of the future, inclusiveness would likely be one key element of it, right? That there can't be a sense that all the winnings are going to a small group, but that really we're developing small businesses, local businesses, we're serving the economy where it is.
Exactly. I mean, in African markets, sort of 90% of the economic backbone consists of smaller and medium-sized enterprises. So if we don't focus on them, there's no way we can achieve longer-term growth and sustainability, whether it's in West Africa or within the continent as a whole. And this is where the importance of providing tools and removing that information asymmetry to actually remove those biases that are often skewed towards sort of larger corporations. And that's where I feel business innovation and technology can come in and really play a role in achieving sort of longer-term growth for businesses.
I'm just wondering if we can bring you back into the discussion, Minister. Just you're our government representative here, and in the end, so much of this comes back to government.
Yep.
And thinking about your approach, where you brought in private sector and said these social problems are really your problems too. Do you see that as something that is scalable across countries? Do you see this as something where governments really need to step up and become kind of market designers? Because most of the conversations I think we have on this topic, it's really corporate leaders talking about designing markets of the future. What's your view on that?
Well, I think this is the most powerful tool that governments have. If you have bad policies, you will have bad results. You have good policies, you will have very good results. And that's have been proven all over the world. But there is another subject that is important for that. In the type of society that we're living in, you need not only human individual capital to solve problems. You give education, you give drinkable water, you give access to financial services, whatever. You need social capital. You need that people, you're not going to solve everything. You will always have losers and winners. That's part of life. But people need to feel that people care, that if you lose, then somebody cares of what happened with you. Right. If you're poor, then you will be poor. Nobody will get you to be rich in a second. But somebody will be worried about what happened to you. So if we need to build a society where people feel that people are worried about each one. Otherwise, you will not have a human development because you will lose too much effort, too much energy in conflicts. And that's what you see everywhere in the world. Yeah. I'm coming from Paris. You have the Gilets jaunes. And what are those people complaining of? And that's true all over the world about everything. So you need to take people that have more advantages in human capital, education, resources, social networks, whatever, and see those people worrying about the country and about the most wicked sectors of the society. So not only that they're going to give a very good solution, which I think they will, and sometimes very, very easy. Let's say, for example, on jails, it was very easy. You just needed to change the regulation. Now we're allowing people to work in jail. So now we have factories, people can work voluntarily, of course, inside, but then when they get out, you can hire them.
Right.
They have skills, but also there's a much lower risk because you already know how he's working, if he steals the tools or whatever, if it's dangerous, then you can hire them and then receive a contract when they get out. Sometimes you can change a regulation, sometimes you can create an SBI to make a payment on a result, a social impact bond or whatever. So you can find different ways. Sometimes it's only collaboration, like in SDG number 17, which is, I think, the most important one of all of them. Let's solve it together, because that creates social capital. So on one way, good results to solve specific problems. On the other one, create a better society to live in.
Jesper, that kind of long-term thinking is really hard. As Aron said, in a moment when crises seem to be taking over the headlines, how does a business like yours actually stay long-term focused when you've got to worry about the next quarter, when you've got such tremendous competition and disruption from technology?
I think it's one of the big questions for corporations, and it has many layers. I remember our founder passed away almost a year ago, 91 years old. We asked him how we should think about the future a few months before. He said, you need a long-term view. We said, how long-term? And he said, 200 years, it would be good. And we're combining a 3-year plans with a 200 perspective, and that can actually, that dynamic can help a little bit. I think in a way you need to have a long-term view to believe. If you have a short horizon, you will be too practical and you will have fear in the system. So you need to allow yourselves a bit of perspective to be absolute in the way you think. And then you need the opposite in your implementation and your execution, because otherwise you will be too slow to start acting. And would it be easy? You know, but most of these topics are not. That means you need to step in, you need to learn, you need to work with others in order to find the solutions as we speak about here. That's what we try to do.
I just want to give everyone the warning, we're going to come to you for questions in a second, so start thinking about those. And I want Anne just to ask you a question before we go there, and that's about essentially this vision that Jesper's putting out there. Is the problem, in terms of the pace of moving capital markets in the direction we all want to move, is the problem that there aren't enough Jespers, there aren't enough companies with the long-term vision? Or is the problem the investors? You know, there aren't enough investors who have a long-term vision. Where are we stuck in terms of getting to the real kind of scale where we're not having a session called Building Sustainable Markets, because that's the de facto reality of the economies we live in?
I actually think we're on the tipping point of that now, because our investors, our employees, our customers are demanding it. So they don't want to live in a 1%, 99% world. They don't want to see us waste. And so the first thing is just on energy efficiency. I mean, it is less expensive to operate our plants and our buildings if we're energy efficient. Our employees expect us to be good citizens of the world and good employers, good benefits, that sort of thing. And our clients, more and more, are looking for what is your ESG rating. We know that those that have higher ESG ratings have lower volatility and better sustainability in terms of earnings, not in terms of the environment. So these things have become a truth that can't be denied, as opposed to a new thought that's barely hanging on.
Right, right. Let's go out to others. We're going to take a few questions at a time. So I see one here in the front. We'll take yours, and others can begin thinking. Just let us know your name, please, and organization, if you can.
My name is Andrew Wilson. I'm with the Center for International Private Enterprise. we've seen in some settings where government speaks one language and the private sector speaks another language. Sometimes government has, there may be a similar goal out there, but the objectives along the way to that goal sometimes differ. Can you share with us maybe some success stories of how you can approach that and bridge that communication gap that sometimes exists between public sector and private sector?
Thank you for that question. Before we jump into answer, are there any other hands with a question here? Okay, we'll take those other two. You can pass the mic over.
Catherine Cunningham from Thrive Global, and also interviewing for Eurovision. My question is, if we're talking about designing future markets, the design process is a very dynamic, agile process. So it always sort of trumps me as to figure out why are we so conflicted with short-term and long-term visioning? Because you have to produce a product now, you have to work now and produce something of value now. But at the same time, if you don't have that long-term future vision, you won't persist because you will have lost the competitive innovation advantage, especially today in such a fast-paced, technologically advanced world. If the panel could speak to that, I'd be thrilled.
Thank you. And then one more here in the front.
Hi, Carolina Sachs from Axe Foundation, Stockholm, Sweden. I just wondered, I think if we're going to build long-term sustainable markets, we need to apply some kind of natural capital accounting where we include externalities. Otherwise, when are we going to hit those really hard walls of the end of resources? Because if it's still much cheaper to use non-renewable resources, it's going to take too long time, I think.
Yeah.
I would love to hear your comments on that.
Excellent questions. In fact, maybe we'll start on that one if we can. And I'm sure Anne and others and Aron probably also want to chime in on this, and anyone is welcome to. There are some companies who may already be factoring this in. There's some voluntary standards. But when are we going to get to that point? Maybe we are at that tipping point where these externalities are all part of the way you look at financial results for a company.
Yeah, sure. We're all evaluated, I think, on ESG, or many of us are evaluated on ESG. I think what you're asking is a more complicated question because there are a lot of third parties evaluating companies right now. And it's like a series of Venn diagrams. They're mostly alike, but not entirely alike. So it's hard to know what matters most. And then on the impact side, what kind of impact it has, it's required if you issue or underwrite a green bond. It's not so much required in some other industries or how you would look at something more generally. That's coming. I mean, there are impact studies. There's a group, Y Analytics, who is just going to start to do this so that for every dollar you spend, they can literally tell you what the value was to the marketplace, not in theoretical terms, but in actual terms. That will matter. So I hope that at some point we have fewer front-end evaluating MSCI, GRI, Sustainalytics, not because they aren't all good, but because there are too many of them.
Yeah, these are all indices of ways of kind of measuring ESG, and they're all quite different, right?
Well, they're not so different. They're just not quite alike. And then on the back end, you have to do it for green bonds now. Eventually, I think you'll have to do it for everything, which only means for those doing it, there is a little bit of a margin compression there because you need more people to do it.
Aron, you wanted to chime in?
It's a crucial question, and I would agree. I think we have too many indices, but we have too few models to enable business decision making. So the example that I've heard on multiple occasions is in the mining sector, where do you go ahead with a mine or do you not go ahead with a mine? And are the community issues considered in that decision? Are the environmental risks considered in those decisions? Is the regulatory risk? Regulatory risk often is. The first two often are not, and that leads to bad decision making. So I would love it if we had fewer indices, but I would also like it if we had more developed ways of measuring how and where and what type of investments to make upfront. There is, just a short plug, I just rotated off the board of the Natural Capital Coalition, which is aiming to do exactly this. And it's made a lot of progress, but it's still relatively immature, and I hope that more companies will be piloting this so that more informed decisions will be taken.
Yes, Brodin.
Just to say that we agree with you that we should do them. It's just, it would be good if we had fewer of them and over time.
But the indices measure performance after the fact, and I think there's too much of that.
Yeah.
There aren't as many tools developed
That
to
are
aid in the-
predictive.
Exactly.
For decision making, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe representing a company also. You know, I think also touching a bit on the vision. If there is a drive towards a sustainable market, and if I look at government representatives, if there is a clear direction, if it's too short term, then there will be stress in the system and it will not necessarily drive the right behavior. But if it's a clarity in any given market that this is where we want to be in 5-10 years from now, and that we're driving reform in order to go there. The thing is, it will be a level playing field, good for all companies. It's clear. And then creativity can start. We can start looking at where curves cross, etc. So I think the clarity and the vision that is shared between companies and the governments is what the sustainable market is all about.
And are you saying
here I
this
see a great opportunity, to be honest.
And are you saying this in part because it doesn't exist? You're not seeing that?
It's interesting. I'm very optimistic, to be honest. I see, look at the dialogue this week and what's going on now in the world. Not everybody is taking part of the dialogue. Not everybody even acknowledge the issues that we are faced with. But enough companies, enough governments are part of that movement. So I think by bringing that clarity, it will mean change, but it's the same change that every company needs to go through, and that would be helpful.
Yeah, without that level playing field, bad actors can say, well, I can still use inexpensive non-renewable fuels and have better results and higher margins, and then it dissuades others and disincentivizes others from investing in for the long term and for a carbon-free world, et cetera. I want to get to Andrew's question because I think it's related. You know, in a way, everyone up here is speaking the same language, but maybe we're not representative of what's really out there in the world in terms of government, private sector, investors, et cetera. How do you see this, Minister? And again, Andrew's question was about how do we make an effective public-private partnership when we're all kind of coming at this with very different perspectives?
Well, what I see is that most governments are not using enough public-private partnerships because they don't trust too much, because they feel, mostly at least in Latin America, they feel that governments should say what to do, how to do it, and they should do it by themselves. And some people say, you know, no, governments should only say what to do and how to do it, but then we can pay a subsidy, let's say, we can give some money so that some people from the private sector can do the job. My own feeling is that we need to change that. If we're going to make a private partnership in a certain thing, then we must agree that we will do a lot of things together, because otherwise we will not be using the resources of each one. And from technology, for example, where the private sector is much more advanced than what you see on governments and on the public sector, to speed for solutions, to flexibility, and the capability of obtaining a huge number of resources. If you don't merge all those things with all the capabilities of the government that can change rules, regulations, laws, it can explain to the society why you are doing this, which is politicians, no, which are very useful. It's part of the system. So I think today we're not using enough of those, and we're not giving enough scope to what they're doing.
Niama, you know, I'm going to guess that your circumstance in the context you're working is different than what I experience in the U.S. For example, I live in Washington, D.C., and if you walk around my neighborhood, you find these electric scooters everywhere, all over the sidewalks, right? And these scooters arrived before there was a regulatory environment, before government even knew what was happening. And it's very much a Silicon Valley mindset. Hey, we're just going to kind of go in over the top. You're working on things where you're sending goods across borders, you have to deal with logistics and payments, financial transactions. I'm guessing it's not so easy for you to just go around government. What is your experience like, listening to the minister, what is your experience like trying to work with government as you launch a startup company that is developing really significant business across markets?
So I guess for us, our focus has been about not so much about regulation at the moment. It's more about streamlining processes. So gaining efficiencies through this through streamlining processes. And essentially what that means is it sort of goes back to the whole idea of the infrastructure building, is how can we make it more efficient for a company in Togo or Senegal or Ivory Coast to source, to pay in a much quicker way. So often, for example, even to pay an international supplier, you have to go through multiple steps. Our startup and the sort of payment solution that we've developed, where we are able, for example, to accept local payments and pay suppliers internationally from our international subsidiaries, means that payment can happen in one day instead of 2 weeks, where an importer would have to go through the central bank and various other processes and stuff. So the way we see it is we focus on efficiencies, we focus on showing impact, showing results, before we worry too much about the regulatory impact. And at that point, I think you actually have results, you have data, you have analytics, and it makes your conversation a lot more powerful than going to the public sector and saying, oh, we want this to be easier to do. It's like, well, this is what we've achieved with your constraints. So imagine without the constraints what the impact would be. And so I guess that's more our approach towards, as a startup, towards achieving that kind of growth and really trying to have a difference. And I think also just something, going back to the other question actually, just
yeah, please, go ahead.
my mind is you talk about sort of the short and long-term impacts, and often it's seen as a trade-off. And I guess as a startup, like you obviously as a startup you still have a long-term vision, but you have to act fast because you're dealing with competition, you're dealing with ever-changing dynamics, and this is where things like being agile in your processes become extremely valuable. And this is perhaps something that can be transposed into the regulatory or public sector, things like agile governance, where you take processes that work in startups where you're quick, where it's iterative, where you experiment, where it's very data focused, but it's quite like recursive and iterative. And instead of trying to be like, oh, I'm going to build something that's going to come in line in like 3 or 4 years, well, by the time you get there, everything's changed. So you're like always sort of like catching up. And so I think that's something that would be interesting to experiment with, which is using agile methodologies using startups, but in the public sector.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up that question, Catherine. And I think you may have coined a term there, agile governance. It sounds a lot like what you're trying to do, Minister. Any other thoughts on this point? And how do you get?
Well, in fact, in Chile, part of what we're doing to create an incentive for new ideas for this social problem is that we created a fund so you can compete. So we have these 16 problems, people working on them. If they have an idea, they want to make a pilot program, we cannot handle all of them. So let's compete. So it's like you present your project and we will finance it. If it shows some good prospects, then you can do it. So we try to create as many instruments so that they can be able to obtain the best results.
I'm back to the question itself. I do think these partnerships are difficult at first, but the first thing is, are you solving a problem that has scale, that has, because then you can get the partners. And then what we're seeing is whether it's something as prosaic as street lighting in Los Angeles, we help through a green bond change all the lighting to LED lighting, and with that they reduce their energy bill and were able to pay the coupon on it very easily, to more complicated issues where you had to do an affordable housing project. You had to put early money in that was locally based, was not big government. It was just a locally based project. But it had a beginning, middle, and end. It was well thought out. We felt that if we put early money in, that we could attract other investors, and we were able to do that. So it's finding an idea that is well thought out, is scalable, even if it's in a neighborhood, if you will, that would, once people hear it, make common sense, and then you need to your either first investor or your first lender. That's what we're able to do. much more often than we ever did before.
Yeah, I want to go back to others for questions, but I'm glad you brought up that word scale, because most of what I hear from corporates and from government is they love public-private partnerships, but there are just so many of them, and many of them are small, they're not relevant, they're not getting to the fundamental questions I think we're talking about on this panel of actually changing the market, changing it at a systemic level. Go ahead, Aron.
There's an example from the United States, because we have a federal system. It's pretty clear that the internal combustion engine's days are numbered. How quickly will we shift to electric vehicle fleet? Well, there are 50 states in the United States and 50 different kinds of subsidy systems for people to transition to electric vehicles. Guess what? In the states where there are public-private deals and state subsidies, things move much more quickly, and in states where that doesn't exist, we're not making the same progress. So I think this is what proves the point that something as big as the entire automobile vehicle fleet in a country with 350 million people only moves if there's consistent effort.
Yeah. Makes great sense. Again, I want to go out to see if there are questions or thoughts. Is there anything we're missing? We have one here in the front. Anything this conversation is missing so far?
I am Alessandro Panerai, Global Shapers from the Milan Hub. Building on what Ms. Finucane and Mr. Cramer were just saying, given that it's extremely tough to build a shared taxonomy of what ESG are among all these indexes out there, I'm particularly afraid that this kind of sort of standards might be unable to funnel funds where they are really needed. So venture capital, for instance, private equity, certain segments of project finance. How do you think we can create a shared strategy at a global level, sort of a globalization 4.0 thinking, in order to solve these kind of shortages, these kind of issues?
Thank you for that question, Alessandro. I don't see another hand now. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
There's one there, next to Terry. Yeah? No? Okay. Well, I think Alessandro's point's a good one, because we did kind of gloss over that issue. We brought up the idea that there may be too many indices, that it's very hard to develop these standards. We talked about it as a pretty fundamental question. So what do we actually do? How do we get to a set of shared principles reflected in a system of standards that everyone in the capital markets can agree to? How do we get there?
I don't know that I think it's trial and error a little bit in the early days, but there are private equity funds now that are investing in the Sustainable Development Goals with impact at the other side. Now, they're obviously looking for something that would have a return that would be acceptable to their investors, but it's happening, and it wasn't happening several years ago. There are funds that people invest in. I mean, we're talking into the billions and trillions now that never existed before. So I think that these things that were just, occasional have become more ordinary. But if you were to have something that didn't have a return that a private equity entity would be willing to do, they now, because we're just in the middle of this, may turn to a commercial bank who will take a lesser return, but we also want less risk. So this is the idea of blended finance. We want less risk, but we'll take a lower return. The development bank, even more so, much longer time horizon, a little better on the risk. Private equity, obviously, high risk, high return, and then philanthropies that come in. So we have found, whether it's a solar project, a wind farm, these are real, an agricultural project where we can, on a blended basis, stand something up none of us would have done on our own. This is happening. Now, it's not happening on the scale that the industrial world is used to, but it is happening, and it's happening with more frequency. And of course, the more success we have, the more we'll do it. And the more success we have, our competitors will look to do it too.
Are there other questions or points that people wanted to raise? I want to go back to the panel and ask you what I just asked everyone here, which is, what are we missing in this conversation? You're all working on this in your own way, but every day you think about sustainable markets. What have we not discussed that we need to, Jesper?
Yeah, I mean, everything we talk about I think is relevant, but maybe to bring back consumers, people, into the equation, because as we have talked about also, there are a lot of frustrations, a lot of worries, a lot of awareness happening And like in our recent study that I was referring to before, we found out that actually 90% of people are interested in changing their behavior. 3% know how. So there's a huge gap today in society. There's a willingness and awareness, and which can, of course, lead to frustration, even cynicism. But there's a gap to actually, how can I contribute? How can my family be a part of this change? And that, I think, is a very interesting topic and a void that we can fill together.
Yeah, it's true. I think consumers feel they're part of a consumerist culture. They're buying and buying products. How do they continue to have the lifestyle they want to have, but also play a positive role on the environment, on social issues? And that is the intention is a lot easier to have than how do you actually do it in your life. What have you found for your consumers?
To start with, I think we're positively surprised on the research was 14,000 people in 14 markets, so it's not a small thing, I think. So 90% wants to change and partake in the change. That is very good news. Yeah. So I think, again, to work with a lot of people to make sure that you can have solutions and bring solutions to live where 1 + 1 + 1 becomes a lot in the end of the day will be one of the equations that we will try to engage ourselves more in the future.
Niama?
I think maybe one thing that's missing is focusing also on the human capital element. So, as the sustainable goals become more prominent, people need to drive these. People need to have the right skills to be able to impact businesses to be more sustainable. So, so in a way, like businesses can also start, having more sort of programs that promote acquisition of talent for these skills and that transfer of knowledge.
Yeah, and you're thinking of human capital at the firm level.
At the firm level, exactly.
But there's, of course, the human capital at the global or national level. And
the education level, exactly.
The World Bank has their human capital index. Jim Kim, who just resigned from the bank, that was kind of his big project there. And the goal was to get these kinds of factors, investing in people's health and education, to actually eventually affect even their sovereign ratings and to affect financial markets. And that's maybe a high goal, a high ambition, but perhaps we can get there at some point. So in our last time, we have very few minutes left. I just want to go back around the room and get your take on really two questions, and they're sort of connected. And earlier used the word tipping point. It says we've made a lot of progress and we're close. If we come back and do this panel next year, what will we need to have done between now and then? What do you think is possible between now and then to kind of get us past that tipping point? Again, there's frustration on the streets. I think there's frustration even with people within this world who believe in this, who want to see markets be sustainable, the people who are at the front of this. How do we deliver on the promises that we're all trying to make? Aaron, do you want to start us off?
Sure, having had 12 seconds to think over my answer.
But you've been thinking about this for a lifetime.
Yeah. So I think a lot of sustainability thinks about the things we don't like in the economy and not enough time about developing a vision for what a true 21st century, truly sustainable economy looks like. And it's a vision that, of course, has to take into account climate and water and biodiversity, but it does also have to take into account these other factors. I think human capital in a world where we're, for the most part, living much longer, where shared solutions are the only way forward, where ESG investments are a big part of it. So I think it's been great to see a lot of business leaders stand up and say, these are the things we don't like seeing. I think a clearer vision about what we're aiming for. And the SDGs are a little too abstract, so that doesn't tell you, that's not a market vision, that's not an individual business vision. So create that clarity of vision, which I don't think we've quite coalesced around right now.
That's a great point. Anyone else want to pick up on this? Go ahead, Jesper.
Maybe to build, I fully agree. And I will say there's another possible tipping point that I'm fascinated about, and that is we're moving from, hopefully, from dialogue, understanding the issues to actually taking action. So I think what I would like to see is more placing ourselves in the great examples, the front runners and the good examples, because they will show the way.
So just to add to that, I think that's right. I think the more examples that become more prolific, of course, that then begets more. And also, I believe the change is happening as we speak because our employees and our customers are demanding it. and our employees and our customers, are younger and younger. I mean, the older die, the younger come along, and this is a way of life and an expectation. It's a global marketplace, and people want to be proud of the companies they work for and the products that they buy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to the extent that this becomes a real comparative advantage, right? Some companies are making it their comparative advantage, but to the extent it becomes the standard, because your employees demand it and your customers demand it, that will start to move us forward. So others thinking about, if we come back next year, what do we want to see done that could get us over this tipping point, Minister?
Yeah, I think there is one key word that we're missing, which is collaboration. It's we see that in the private sector. More and more companies are beginning to be successful in a, not, of course, competitive environment, but also in a collaboration mood with customers, with things like Wikipedia, like Waze, like many other things were impossible many years ago. And I think we need to use that in this more general thing, with collaboration between the public sector, the private sectors, the universities, the people suffering the problem. The power that you can unleash from that is incredible. What everybody can bring to the table, even without money. There are some resources that everybody has that are no cost for them, but very valuable for other people. And you can find out different ways of doing things that maybe you didn't even think before. And SDGs, for example, there are 16 of them, which says what to do. There is one, number 17, which says how to do it, which is for all of them. It says do it through alliance. The fact of doing it together not only will give you better answers, they will be in itself something that will be good.
And what would you say to those who say, well, we can tax our way or regulate our way to that end goal?
Well, of course, I think that's true. In any subject, in any field, the private sectors, the NGOs, move much more faster than government. They see the problems before, they move before, they make earnings or make movements in a long time before government. But then you need the government to try to figure out what tax do you need to put, what subsidy, what regulation, so that everybody will work for that problem. So I think the work for politicians, for regulators, governments, parliaments, it's
all part of this picture.
Yes, and as important as it was before. But we need to learn for those people that are ahead of us. So we need to use the technology. We need to use for example, NGOs, they discover social problems many times in advance from governments. So when governments get there, there has been 10 or 20 years people from NGOs working on that problem.
And Niama.
So one thing we often say is don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And that essentially means focus on the results, focus on getting there, and then, which links to what you're saying, that's when the government follows, because you've already shown the results, so at that point you can ask for forgiveness, but the train is already rolling. So that's something that we're very much focused on, is results, and actually using regulatory constraints to be more innovative, but always within, always within legality, obviously. And if anything, it really shows, like, you realize the creativity and the innovation that can come from solutions as you try to find ways around things and just focusing on getting there and showing results. And those results themselves drive real policy change.
Well, I have to say, I agree with the panel, and I agree with Anne, that 2019, I think we will look back at this and think this really was a moment in time, that we really started to reach some kind of critical, with all the challenges in the world. In a way, maybe we can take from that the urgency that we all desperately need to do more of this and to do it faster. So I want to thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. I want to thank the forum for putting it on. I can't think of anything more important than the way we entirely revolutionize and rethink and reimagine the way our economy works. So those of us at Devex are going to cover this issue as we have. We think it's really important. So thank you all for being a part of it. Please join me in thanking the panelists.